Mr. Marles, thanks for your time. Do you welcome the fact that community pharmacies will be able to apply from Monday to be part of the vaccine rollout?
Yeah, we welcome that, and it's a good development. But we shouldn't forget that under the original strategy, it was intended that pharmacies should be involved in this process back in May. Here we are now in the middle of July. So far from claiming this is accelerating this particular step, where this should have happened a long time ago. I mean, we've been saying for some time we really need to have all hands on deck in terms of those who are able to administer the vaccines, and in this case, AstraZeneca. So it's a step in the right direction, but again, it's happening far too late, and it's fundamentally happening far too late because this is the Prime Minister who said that it wasn't a race, and yet it very much is a race. There
are many wondering why the pharmacists weren't used from the get-go. You talk about May, but there's an argument to say that they should have been there from the get-go. They are the public face, or the health official that really people see more than anyone else.
Look, I think that's a really good point, Kieran, and we need to have all hands on deck in terms of getting jabs into people's arms, and pharmacists had a really important role to play from the beginning. So it really has us confused as to why it's taken this amount of time to get pharmacists into the game. It is one aspect where this government has been getting it wrong from day one. It has not got the logistics right in terms of how to administer the vaccine. But I mean, the other point to make here is that this is in respect of AstraZeneca. Ultimately, the supply now in relation to Pfizer and then Moderna is what's going to be needed to get the job done in the country. And that's really where we need to see this government acting. And it's the fact that we don't have supply in relation to those vaccines on hand right now, which is why we stand at this moment in time with only 11% of our population fully vaccinated, and why we are living in the land of the lockdown as a result.
The Prime Minister said that he is certainly sorry that they haven't met the benchmarks that they'd set on vaccinations. So he did apologise today. When it comes to the broader situation, though, he makes the point that if you look at the rest of the OECD, developed nations, if you look at the average deaths and per capita arrangements, we would have lost 30,000 more people if things had been handled differently. Do you accept that overall assessment of the situation where we are doing much better than comparable nations?
Well, I think if we're going to look at what happened last year and the ability for us to hide from the virus, which was a very important part of dealing with this initially, we had a lot of natural advantages in our favour. We're an island with a limited number of entry points. We're kind of at the end of the line. We're not a hub in terms of international travel. So all of that was in our favour. That said, a great job was done last year. It was principally done by the states, if we're being honest, in terms of the measures that were put in place to make sure that we had the lockdown such that we didn't see the spread of this disease. It's really, there is no end to this government's ability to engage in self-congratulation. And it's really that which has been the problem, Kieran, because it's bred a complacency on the part of Scott Morrison and his government, which meant that last year, instead of putting ourselves in the queues of the various vaccine projects around the world, he was sitting on his hands. He bet the house on AstraZeneca, and that's why we now find ourselves in a position where we don't have the supply in place right now. And on the question of the Prime Minister apologising, I mean, he's obviously spoken to his advisors, got some market research saying that he needs to go out and apologise today, and we've seen what he said. I mean, the only point I'd make is you can't find character in a focus group. At the end of the day, that is in Scott Morrison or it is not. And this is a Prime Minister who consistently fails to take responsibility when he is put on the spot to do so. That's what we saw yesterday. That's what we've seen time and again since Scott Morrison has been Prime Minister, and in fact in Parliament. What was on display yesterday was a complete failure of character on the part of this.
You talk about the fact that we're an island and those sorts of things working in our favour, but the government's own policies have helped drive a successful response here in the sense of certainly the economic performance, 1 million jobs created over recent months and more people in employment than before the pandemic. There aren't many nations that can say that.
Look, JobKeeper was a critical response last year, and the government deserves credit for it. But let's also be clear about the truth of what happened there. Initially, they were saying wage subsidies were a danger. They had to be dragged kicking and screaming to that position. Ultimately, they do put in place JobKeeper. But when it comes to an end in March of this year, notwithstanding the fact that they are budgeting, or were then, for there being lockdowns such as what we are facing now, there was no scheme put in place to replace JobKeeper at that moment in time to deal with the current circumstances that we find ourselves in. And so as a result, the package that we've seen developed over the last 4 or 5 weeks has really been this government making it up as they've gone along. There is nothing like the certainty for small businesses and for workers in Sydney and for those areas of the country which are locked down now about what they can expect from government to help them get through this. I mean, right now, if you're sitting in Sydney, it is really difficult to see the end in sight in respect of this lockdown. Yeah. But there's no question around that. There's no response in respect of rental relief. There are real issues for individuals who are trying to access the COVID payment. We're seeing massive queues in front of Centrelink. I mean, all of this is because when they removed JobKeeper in March of this year, notwithstanding that they foresaw that these events would occur, they did not put something in place. So even in respect of the economic response right now, this is a government which is failing, and what the country is experiencing, frankly, is a dog's breakfast.
We're almost out of time. Just quickly, the John Coates Palaszczuk exchange. What's your reaction to that?
Oh, look, that is hard to watch, to be frank. I agree with the comments that you and Andrew were making earlier, and I really do hope that John Coates says something of an apology to Anastasia Palaszczuk. Anastasia doesn't deserve to be treated like that in public, and I think it's an extraordinary piece of footage, and really it needs to be cleaned up and needs an explanation, and whatever else. Anastasia Palaszczuk does not deserve to be treated in that way in public or in private, to be frank.